Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. So my old channel was barely a month old when I made a video Ancap versus the alt-right in its second part. For context, the clash between Marxists and the alt-right in Charlottesville, South Carolina in the fall of 2017 had just happened. The alt-right had planned an event called Unite the Right to protest government officials removing the Confederate flag from display on land they fraudulently claimed as theirs. Those who recall may remember there was a wave of Confederate flag removals in the US at the time on the grounds that they were racists. That removing them would somehow stop people from seeing certain racial groups as inferiors. Anyways, the alt-right argued that the Confederate flag was a part of their history in the United States, particularly in the southern states, and removal of the flag constituted an attempt to purge the recollection of that history. The belief was that the protest would signal to politicians that following through on the flag removals would hurt their re-election chances. Then came the Marxists, who mobilized en masse to counter-protest. The result was a melee. Violent clashes were common, including one fatality from someone driving their car into a protester. This history lesson should suffice to recall why the Charlottesville Statement exists. It being the political mini-manifesto written by Richard Spencer to explain the alt-right, what they stood for, and what they wanted. In my part 2 of the Charlottesville video, I go through it point by point to examine their ideas from an anarchist perspective. However, at the time, I was relatively new to anarchism, and I did not have a very solid grasp on philosophical libertarianism. So, I thought it'd be fun to go through the manifesto one more time, over 3 years later, and improve on what I said. Do note that among the things I failed to identify in the 2017 video, the statement is extremely presuppositional. I grant that it's not the author's fault, as the author is likely trying to be succinct to appeal to the normies, but I will do my best to respond to it, making my best assumptions as to former Hoppian Richard Spencer's intent to try to steelman them and present them as he would. Anyways, let's go.
Race is real. Race matters. Race is the foundation of identity. White is shorthand for a worldwide constellation of peoples, each of which is derived from the Indo-European race, often called Aryan. European refers to a core stock, Celtic, Germanic, Hellenic, Latin, Nordic, and Slavic, from which related cultures and a shared civilization sprang.
Points for honesty, they're just straight us telling they're identitarians. However, just saying they're identitarians doesn't explain anything about their ideas or the veracity of their conclusions. This is the mistake I made in my previous video that really only appealed to anyone who agreed with my presupposition that identitarianism bad. But why is it bad? Identitarianism argues that the well-being and functioning of society is dependent on ethnicity and culture. Thus, the combination of its defense and development is seen as necessary. What does defense or development mean? We'll get into that shortly. But what this entails is a series of policy prescriptions imposed by government to achieve certain goals. Specifically through prohibitions on freedom of movement through closed state borders and using government-sponsored industry cartels and central banking to centrally plan economic activity to favor the ethno-cultural group in question, often pushed forward with rhetoric that the economy must work for the people or some such, which you'll see again later. Now, what this actually means is a ruling elite of lying sociopaths victimizing people in society by making ownership claims over other people's property. Economic activity deemed not working for the people, a conclusion only reached arbitrarily, needs to be controlled, restricted, licensed, or stopped altogether regardless of the victim's superior claim to ownership over the resources being regulated. If you, owning a car, is deemed not working for the people, then the government will steal your car from you. Similarly, your exercising of free association will be stymied by closed border policies that inhibit trade. Collectives cannot demonstrate self-ownership, thus they cannot have rights, as rights are entailed by self-ownership. As such, a collective cannot make ownership claims over any resources, let alone resources legitimately owned by individuals. To do so would be conceptually invalid, as property is an extension of self-ownership, which, again, collectives lack. Thus, any higher claim to ownership of other people's resources cannot be consistently defended. It's as though identitarians believe that putting enough people the identitarian philosophy claims to not have self-ownership together, suddenly they can get self-ownership. It just doesn't make sense. By simply ignoring these observations, the actions of an identitarian state can only ever be predatory and parasitic. While this is true with every state, we're talking about these guys at the moment. It victimizes everyone in the name of their own little version of the greater good, and the greatest irony of them all, they aren't even going to preserve or advance culture. Culture is the sum of human action, a spontaneous, bottom-up phenomenon of interpersonal interaction influenced by the behavioral preferences of its participants and the economics of their surroundings. As the state is a parasitic entity external to the society it imposes itself upon, its policy prescriptions must create incentives that drive culture away from how it would have configured in the state's absence. For example, artificial scarcity created through economic central planning for the people reduces real incomes, requiring people to work longer and in more jobs drive a culture to become more materialistic. To say nothing about how leverage and credit banking manipulation fundamentally alters how people exchange in terms of the goods and services that are even available in the first place. Far from preserving culture, states actively harm it. But we're not even done yet. Since the state must continually propagandize to people to justify their existence, the state's active antagonism towards culture will be absent from any state-approved narratives. At worst, any damage that is done as a result of the state's actions will be seen as a failure of the state to preserve culture. Identitarians will then take this as proof that identitarianism hasn't identitarianed enough. Thus, calls will ring from the rooftops for more identitarianism, more central planning, and more cultural interventionist shenanigans. All because identitarianism cannot define the parameters by which they could possibly be wrong. They have no hypothesis, making identitarianism completely unfalsifiable. In so doing, it falls out of the realm of science and becomes dogmatic in nature. Once a philosophy stops being epistemological, well, can any claims it makes ever really be called knowledge? Now, everything I said here applies equally to both critical theory Marxists and neo-reactionary alt-righters. Don't think I'm just picking on them here, they're both terrible. Identitarianism is just another form of authoritarian collectivism that wants to use culture or class consciousness to enslave you and delegitimize your interests. Next!
Jews are an ethno-religious people distinct from Europeans. At various times, they have existed within European societies without being of them. The preservation of their identity as Jews was and is contingent on resistance to assimilation, sometimes expressed as hostility towards their hosts. Judeo-Christian values might be a quaint political slogan, but it is a distortion of the historical and metaphysical reality of both Jews and Europeans.
When I first made the video in 2017, it didn't make sense to include this, let alone as number 2, but I know better now. Let me briefly explain. As an ethnic group, Jews are overrepresented in executive positions in Western news, entertainment, academia, technology, finance, government, as well as other fields, for example psychiatry, relative to their percentage as a population. This is attributed to strong in-group preferences as described earlier, where people are hired into these corporations on the basis of identity rather than merit, nepotism in other words. As a group allegedly hostile to their host countries, their leadership positions are used to push forward narratives subversive to the cultures and customs of their hosts. This point leaves the issue open-ended, and depending on who you ask in the alt-right, you'll get different answers as to how to resolve this issue. However, they all agree that Jews as an ethnicity are destructive to the interests of white people. But to this day, I have still not seen any clear causal evidence between the overrepresentation of Jews in these institutions and the presence of a Jewish conspiracy against traditional Western values. At least, not beyond some vague platitudes meant to appeal to a presuppositional victim narrative designed to manipulate the disenfranchised into accepting the alt-right's narrative. But the point of bringing up the issue of Jews is, well, recall what was said in the last entry. Race is real. Race matters. By generalizing Jews as an enemy, they are justifying their expulsion from the arbitrarily defined borders of their ideal coercive monopoly and arbitration, which will entail the appropriation of property. Even if the Jews truly are a unanimously subversive demographic, at the absolute worst case scenario, there is no problem that the Jews would actually be causing that, can't be solved through anarchism. After all, if you have no state, then there's no ruling class for the Jews to subvert, is there?
Nations must secure their existence and uniqueness and promote their own development and flourishing. The state is an existential entity and, at its best, a physical manifestation of a people's being, order, and will to survive. Racially or ethnically defined states are legitimate and necessary.
The state is a monopoly on arbitration. It uses violence, both to enrich itself and enforce said monopoly. This is known as taxation and war, respectively. Since states do not get their revenue from voluntary transactions, it signals that people do not value its services. Thus, to survive, predation is necessary for the state to merely exist. Thus, people whose livelihoods depend on the state have parasitic incentives towards the people, confiscating legitimately owned property and escalating to lethal force should someone try to defend their rights against the state. Theft cannot be logically justified even by appealing to race or ethnicity. Failure to justify the state means its utilization for any means can never be based on knowledge, meaning its actions and organization cannot have any basis in facts or reason, which translates to resource misallocation and artificial scarcity, just to name two simple economic outcomes. Suffice to say, this is the driving force behind virtually all of the alt-right's complaints about modernity that we will observe further on. To get around this, they need to explain why the state is legitimate. If they can explain how the state has a higher claim to my body than I do, they will have not only succeeded, but I will cease to be an anarchist. But I'm not holding my breath. I own myself. I know this because I exercise dominion over my body greater than anyone else. My decision to trade for property or to associate with another is an extension of myself. Nobody can infringe on it without making an indefensible claim to ownership over myself. So by all means, alt-right, make your claims. At a later date, I do want to make a video exploring the concept of nations in more detail, but this will suffice to get my ideas across. Nations are an Enlightenment fabrication that exists for the sole purpose of manipulating diverse swaths of people across vast geographical boundaries into developing feelings of kinship with other people who are also held captive within state territory while creating kinship relations with the state as a parental figure. We are Americans, and we are ruled over by the American government, enabling governments to appeal to these artificial relationships to manipulate the gullible into accepting being maimed, traumatized, and murdered in their rulers' dick-measuring contests in war. Given collectives don't have rights, nations don't have rights. We know this because they cannot demonstrate self-ownership either. Claims that nations must secure their existence or promote their own development have no basis in truth. Since nations cannot have rights, they cannot have interests, let alone interests superior to my claim to bodily autonomy. As nations cannot exist independent of states, process of elimination dictates the negation of Spencer's assertion. Nations are a predatory entity that must be undermined and destroyed at every opportunity. States are parasitic monstrosities, an evil to be opposed, undermined, and abolished.
Spirit is the well-being of culture, and politics is downstream of that. The alt-right rages a situational ideological war on those deconstructing European history and identity. The decrepit values of Woodstock and Wall Street mean nothing to us.
The assumption that politics is an image cast upon a mirror by culture assumes that political entities create no unique incentives for those associated with it. However, there is a class antagonism between the rulers and the ruled, and I described this in detail previously. The point is, the values of white identity and white nationhood mean nothing to me, and until you can demonstrate to me why I should care at all, I don't want to hear it.
The founding population of the United States was primarily Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. By the Great War, a coherent American nation emerged that was European and Christian. Other races inhabited the continent and were often set in conflict or subservience to whites. Whites alone defined America as a European society and political order.
What they founded was an institution actively engaged in evil since the very beginning. I know the United States is by no means unique in this, but anyone who understands the nature of states would regard the foundation of one as a dark stain on their history rather than something to be proud of. On the plus side, nobody alive today is to be blamed for the United States' founding. As eager as many Americans are to feel proud for the accomplishments of peoples they never met. If there is one thing the United States is exceptional in, is that it's the greatest source of evil in the world. If all it did was victimize its own citizens, it would be intolerable, but it would at least be preferable to financing states throughout the third world, leveraging their political economies through financial entanglement and debt to institutions like the IMF and World Bank, in addition to installing dictatorships and bombing entire civilizations into the Stone Age just to maintain its own fracturing political economy. America is evil. How whites defined it is unimportant.
Europe is our common home, and our ancestors' bone and blood lie in its soil. European unity emerged at critical points in history, but so did fragmentation, rivalry, and betrayal. As brother nations, Europeans have competed with one another and even hated and killed one another. We can no longer afford the luxury of intra-racial squabbling. Brothers' wars gain us nothing, and directly lead to our collective downfall. Europeans must come together as a family. The so-called refugee crisis is an invasion, a war without bullets, taking place on the fields of race, religion, sex, and morality. At stake is Europe's very identity. Whether the continent will be the locus of our people's shared story, or become just another Islamic outpost.
I really dropped the ball in the previous video, didn't I? I actually said the alt-right had a point here. It's okay. I know better now. Let's address it. So-called fragmentation, rivalry, and betrayal in European history did not occur in a vacuum. Anyone with a passing understanding of European history would know that, and I'm reasonably sure Spencer knew this too. The difference is that the anarchist understanding of the nature of monopolies, any monopoly, has greater explanatory power than any racially charged narrative Spencer concocts. Monopolies, by their nature, are rivalrous against other monopolies that provide the same thing in differing geographies. Any overlap means neither has a monopoly, and as both have a rivalrous mutually exclusive incentive to expand their territory and no method for resolving these disputes without compromising monopoly privilege, the only means of conflict resolution left is force on force. States can only compete destructively. What Spencer observed as brothers' wars is merely the logical conclusion of monopolies coexisting. This is the basis for war. It's by no means an exclusively European phenomenon, as it has been going on for as long as monopolies existed. If the end of intracontinental brothers' wars is desirable for Richard Spencer, then he must become an anarchist. The abolition of monopolies through economic decentralization and counter-economics disincentivizes the large-scale warfare seen throughout Europe's history. For sure, criminality will not disappear. We're not naive. However, no gang of marauders or mafia has ever been able to commit atrocities on the scale of states, not even close. And before you ask, no, I have no idea what collective downfall or come together as a family means. They're just nice-sounding platitudes. Though, you know he's going to contradict his own rhetoric when we get to his remarks on globalism. As for the refugee crisis, that's another result of government policy. Oh, but Heretic, you're a libertarian, and libertarians want open border policies. Maybe Libertarian Party charlatans, but any government policy on borders, even open borders, is illegitimate, as the state continues to exercise leverage over people's ability to freely associate. But the cause of the migrant crisis is exactly what I just alluded to. It's government policy, specifically confiscation and redistribution of scarce resources into migrant populations through their welfare states, incentivizing migration, while the violence of the state criminalizes even questioning these policies in the name of hate speech. This doesn't even go into why the state does this. I'll leave the details to your imagination, but the short version is the migrant crisis benefits them. Does it not benefit you, Mr. Spencer? Because if it doesn't, that means you're learning about the state's antipathy towards those they rule over. Let's not also forget that the state also actively prohibits people from being able to defend their rights. How the state in Europe forces association with migrants is bad enough, but by having disarmed them a long time ago and criminalizing speech critical of migrants, Europeans are unable to defend their rights against migrant aggression or even to use social pressure to encourage them to look elsewhere for refuge. Knowing this, and knowing that governments only act according to the interests of the rulers, why aren't the alt-right anarchists?
The family, a man and woman, in a loving relationship that produces offspring, is an essential, indispensable foundation for a healthy and functioning society.
You need to define what a healthy or functioning society looks like, or even what you mean by society. Spencer demonstrated his structuralist view of society on numerous occasions in just this list, so we can infer that he does not believe that heterosexual relations are something that men and women should seek out voluntarily. That's what Spencer's God, the state, is for, to impose his ideal for how people ought to behave. But let's take this at face value. Although I agree that heterosexual relationships are desirable and the family is the best place to raise kids in, let's not pretend that it also isn't a source of violence and predation in society, as parents inflict and reenact their traumas onto the kids, perpetuating a cycle of violence that leaves kids traumatized, horrified, confused, and ill-adjusted to society. Not all families are like this, obviously, but more needs to be done in terms of applying libertarian principles and libertarian philosophy to the family.
Man is not a blank slate on which to be written, nor was he born a guileless, noble savage. Human nature, the reality of race, sex, heritability, and innate endowments, is the most powerful force shaping individuals, families, societies, and nations.
I went into a good amount of detail about this in my previous video, but now, in all honesty, I don't care to repeat it because it's not important. There is no human nature argument that can justify the existence of the state or override the incentives the state creates both in its agents, those who benefit from its rule, and those subjected to its arbitrary dictates. Spencer isn't giving us any information here about why human nature is important, how it is the most powerful force, or even what human nature even is. So we'll have to fill in the gaps ourselves. We can observe that humans act purposefully. From this, we can understand that humans at their nature are self-interested. This is the core premise of praxeology, from which we can figure out how incentives for behavior leads to action. This is why we know how the state acts, why it does, and why it will always be parasitic and predatory without fail. If human nature is truly the most powerful force, then Spencer cannot dispute anything I just said, and he must admit the state's freaking evil!
Women, as mothers and caregivers, are key to the future of our race and civilization. We oppose feminism, deviancy, in the futile denial of biological reality, and everything destructive to healthy relations between men and women. We must overcome today's debased and lonely porn culture and return to a sexuality that is fruitful and erotic in the truest sense of the word.
I assume by that he means more femboys. But this is what I was talking about earlier in regards to Spencer's rapacious lust for imposing his personal preferences for how people ought to behave onto society. I touch on a similar topic in my video about morality, but simply, deviancy, porn culture, everything destructive to healthy relations? Does any of these entail unethical behavior? Who is being aggressed against because some dude is wearing a skirt? Is Pornhub stealing my money? All of these are just behavioral preferences, moral claims about how people ought to behave that inform our decision-making in how we choose to associate with others, which is fine. You may actually agree with everything Spencer just said. You may have a strong preference for traditional, heterosexual, monogamous sexual relations and are repulsed by deviations from these behaviors, and that's fine. In fact, I would go further to say that the state has created incentives for the behavioral preferences Spencer is arguing against. For one thing, the welfare state makes it more financially profitable for women to be single parents than to have a father, just to name one example. But the problem I have with Spencer's point is not any preference against traditionalism. I just don't wish it imposed on society, and Spencer's a structuralist.
The foreign policies of European states, including immigration, diplomacy, and war, should be based on the safeguarding of its peoples, and not be beholden to special or foreign interests, nor to corporate profit motives, nor to the chimeras of globalism, humanitarianism, or the end of history. Insofar as chauvinism means attempting to transform non-Europeans into Europeans, we are not Western chauvinists.
In my previous video, I said that Spencer had a point with this remark. I already explained why states are evil and need to be destroyed. I also explained why the state fundamentally can never work in the interests of its peoples due to praxeology and the class conflict between the rulers and the ruled. Taking what I already established, we know that statist foreign policy must enrich the state. Any benefit gained by non-state actors represents an alignment of interests rather than proof that the state exists to serve the people. If Spencer had his magical alt-right ethnostate, this will be the case. No matter how ideologically pure his hand-chosen rulers are, they will be faced with the same economic incentives that drove the current crop of European rulers to bring third-world migrants into their countries by the millions. And this is fundamentally one of the alt-right's major problems. They assume the state operates ideologically, and it's just a question of getting them to follow the correct ideology, as though the state does not have any incentives of its own. I mean, sure, if the state were run by the alt-right, there would be some policy shifts, but these represent marginal adjustments to how the criminal organization conducts itself. The predatory, parasitic, and self-interested nature of the state will never change until the state ceases to exist. Also, you gotta appreciate how he lambasts globalism, but then calls for European unity. I mean, it sounds like he's a big fan of the European Union, I suppose. Or at least should be.
American citizens should enjoy freedom of speech as guaranteed by the Constitution. We endorse this value for all European peoples. We oppose those who seek to suppress the speech of people with whom they disagree, whether through government censorship, corporate policy, digital platform denial, or intimidation.
I would have previously agreed with this sentiment, however note the assumption that free speech is something that people should have, as though it's just another policy prescription. The truth is that people, all people, not just Europeans, already have freedom of speech. It is a right entailed by our bodily autonomy. We've always had freedom of speech, in fact. It's just that governments and their proxies actively aggress against people who exercise it, particularly in Europe. It's something the alt-right won't tell you. You already have all your rights, and you've had them your entire life. The state just victimizes you for exercising them. And yes, corporations such as Google, Facebook, etc. are government proxies. Don't be stupid.
All U.S. citizens and all Europeans should have the right to bear arms, as a means of protecting themselves and their families and enjoying the manly sport of hunting.
I took this at face value before, but now, well, the right to bear arms is not a question of should. All people have property rights as a result of self-ownership. Firearms are just another form of property, and the state has no justification in restricting their property rights, nor is property conditional on need. I'm willing to give Spencer the benefit of the doubt that he does not argue that gun ownership is illegitimate if not used for hunting or defense. But that said, property rights are not conditional. If you can demonstrate a legitimate claim to dominion over a resource, such as a firearm, a tank, or even an intercontinental ballistic missile, it's yours. Nobody has a higher claim to it than you. Everyone already has the right to keep and bear arms. The state is just a criminal organization that kidnaps and cages people for exercising their rights in ways they don't like.